This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning the show is Joe Gerken and Drew Ricketts from K-State with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode where they discuss their involvement in extension and what extension provides for Kansans. Tina Sullivan and Logan Simon, K-State Extension agronomists, continue today's show as they talk about the recent weather damage to wheat, corn, and soybeans. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends the show as he provides an update on the new World Screwworm and how dairy producers can better protect livestock through continual monitoring and evaluation. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
We talk a lot about how we're extension specialists and we work in extension and we throw that word around a lot. But I talked to quite a few people that, one, don't know it exists, or two, don't really know what it is. So this podcast is part of our responsibilities as K-State Extension specialists. Yeah. And so I thought, let's just introduce a little bit about what that means, what is extension, and where did it come from, and why is it important?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great topic. One of the things I think that's challenging for a lot of folks is there's not a ton, in most states at least, there's not a ton of involvement, or at least visible involvement of extension in wildlife management. Yeah. And so that's kind of a place where we are much more involved, especially with one-on-one interactions with folks, than a lot of people are. I've heard people describe it as ivory tower stuff that we do at a university that if you're not heavily involved in research, it's hard to understand why we do some things. Research is such an iterative process where you try and isolate things and you do an experiment like, why would anybody ever spay and neuter coyotes and turn them loose to see if that has any effects on predation? That's not a practical solution. Yeah. But it does allow researchers to figure out the mechanisms that are behind things and then figure out more practical solutions in the future. We've got all different kinds of research, and making that research available to improve people's lives is what extension does.
Yeah, and I think, the basic research and the applied research often go hand in hand.
For sure.
So in order to be able to understand or to look at the research that can be applicable or applied in the field by stakeholders, we have to have that background knowledge. And so they go hand in hand, but generally, not always, researchers kind of fall. Are you going to do more of the basic type research? Theoretical is another word that we throw around. Yeah. Or are you going to kind of do more applied research? And so it's not always one or the other, but, a lot of times it kind of falls in one bucket. But they go hand in hand. They work together. Another thing that I like to point out is that a lot of these research ideas, at least for me, and I'm assuming for you, come from interactions with stakeholders. Yeah. They're issues that people that we're interacting with, especially on the wildlife side, are saying, here's a problem we have. And then, as a researcher, we come up with, well, let's kind of figure out if there's a way to solve that problem. And we might not solve it 100%, but maybe we can incrementally inch towards having a better solution. So listening to people, that's another big aspect of the applied research. Where does the idea for the project come from? What is the what is the availability of extension in Kansas?
Yeah, so that word extension, it's basically just means extending the university to the state, right? Or extending the agricultural scientific community to the state even. But so extension presence in Kansas, we've got a presence in all 105 counties. We haven't really talked about the different structure of personnel within extension, and I think that fits pretty good here. So we're specialists. So we've got a really narrow focus. I focus on wildlife issues. You focus on aquatic issues for the state of Kansas. And we're what they would call state specialists. We can also have regional specialists who might focus on different agricultural or local issues. And then they're going to take information maybe that a state specialist puts together, and they're going to make it more appropriate for their region. And then we're going to have county extension agents. And so that's kind of how that information stream would funnel out to the public a lot of times is you've got a specialist who's putting together information. Maybe there's more of a regional specialist who's going to take that information and make it more specific. And then you've got an agent that interacts a lot day to day with the local folks in their county or their district and helps them with the specific problems that they have. And then it's also kind of a circular deal, right? The agents are communicating back to the specialists, letting us know what challenges they have so that we can help them address the needs that they've got in their county or their district.
Yeah, that cycle, I think, is really important and really cool that we have these resources available to get that information out to the stakeholders. But I think those local extension agents, too, really, they bring a lot of information back to the specialists. Yeah. They're really driving, kind of what information, what direction do we need to go? And so the local extension offices provide so many resources. I'm involved in it, and I think I don't even really understand the breadth of what a lot of these local agents do. And so, reaching out to your local office and participating in some of the events they have, it's really an eye-opening experience. Definitely try to take advantage of some of those opportunities that might arise if you're out there and they're in your region. Let's pivot a little bit and talk maybe more about us specifically as kind of, wildlife specialists. I think fish are wildlife. I don't know if I count as a wildlife specialist or not, but wildlife and fisheries specialists, let's say. So what are some examples, Drew, of maybe, I know that there's a lot of what we do when we go out. It's every day is a little different. And that's probably why we enjoy our jobs so much. But what are some examples of extension type things that you might do on a daily basis? Yeah, so it's super, super, super broad. And that's not just because the topic of wildlife management is so broad. It's also because in order to be a good wildlife specialist or specialist of any kind, you have to stay up to date on the research. So part of what we do is keeping track of the new research about wildlife management. A lot of my focus has to do with wildlife damage control. And so I've got little notifications when a paper that might influence something that I'm going to be involved in comes out. I get those notifications. There's a new paper about coyote predation on livestock, right? So I need to go out and I need to read that paper and think about how I can take that science and help our livestock producers in the state of Kansas based on that science. So keeping up on the research is part of it. Another part of it is communicating that research broadly to folks in the state of Kansas. And that's one of the things that we try and do with this podcast, right? So also through, the videos that are produced from the podcast, getting information out there, but also one of the things that we might do is create an extension publication based on research. So, taking a 10 or 15 page, really, really dense research article that it's hard to know which parts to focus on if you're not an academic researcher and translating that into something that's digestible fairly quickly and that can help somebody. So that would be an extension publication. I also do a lot of one-on-one outreach with folks. So if somebody, just sticking with the wildlife damage theme, let's say somebody is having an issue where they've got beaver that are burrowing into a pond dam, and that beaver burrowing into the pond dam can cause a failure of that system for them, right? It's something you see a lot too. I do, yeah.
The one thing that I do a lot of that I didn't talk about is public meetings. So last year I did somewhere between 30 and 40 visits where I would go to a county or a district and give a presentation about a topic that was requested by the agent in that county or district. A lot of those have to do with coyotes and beaver. A lot of them might have to do with deer management. But basically what I'm doing is putting together a lecture like maybe I would in a class where we're talking about the science and teach people about, let's say, whitetail deer biology, how you can manage habitat to produce more from your place or produce better quality individuals from your place. We also would talk about disease, reproduction, population management, and all those different things that fall into there. So it's really, anything that involves taking science and helping people improve their lives, empowering people to help themselves is kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, and extension looks very similar for me. It's just I would be talking more about, fish in a pond or access for livestock to get in the pond. And I think, one of the really fun things you talked about is, kind of getting that information out in lots of different ways, I think is really important. I think one of the other things we do is create resources to empower those local extension agents. And so, training them to answer some of the day-to-day questions that might come in related to fisheries or wildlife management, creating resources behind the scenes that the public, will never see, but that empowers this whole system to work a little bit more efficiently. So, lots of that I know on my end, meeting a lot with pond owners, workshops, all kinds of that stuff too. So I think getting that information out in as many ways as we can is one of the really fun things. And like you said, we're part of the whole system. And so we don't work without the local agents, and the local agents don't work as well without us. And I think viewing us kind of as a team is really important.
Yeah, for sure. And I that was a big omission on my part, but I definitely prepare information that agents present and prepare information that they would take out to the public too. And that's they're the main face of extension. And so it's really, really important for us to be helping them as much as we can to do their jobs.
Once again, that was part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. You can hear the full episode by following the links in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing crop damage from recent weather with K-State Extension agronomists Logan Simon and Tina Sullivan. Logan, Tina, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us on.
Logan, first wanting to talk about wheat. How is it looking with the recent weather?
Yeah, so as with everything that we're going to talk about today, and as is normal for Kansas, our weather patterns have been highly variable across the landscape. Some folks have had some pretty severe storms, including a lot of wind and even hail in some cases. This is also affecting our wheat that is ready for harvest or getting ready for harvest. What this has done is laid some wheat down in places, and if not, it has just really ground everything to a halt. We have slowed everything way down. Timing is actually not all that different from average, but way delayed considering how advanced our wheat crop was compared to normal here this year. In some places, we are seeing wheat that is lodged down where it was tall enough to go over in the wind. The biggest concern when we get lodged wheat is that it traps humidity there in the heads that can cause the seed to reabsorb water. And once that grain swells with water, it will never shrink back down to its original size. So it loses density, and in that way, we see a decline in test weight. Some other things that we can see come on are a few different diseases that we may be more likely to see where we've got wheat down. Things like sooty mold, that's that black chaff that can form on there. You'll definitely notice it when you get a lot of black stuff coming out the back of a combine. And then we also have a disease that can show up in that kernel, and that is called black point. And that is an infection of the embryo in that kernel. And it's especially problematic when we're talking about seed wheat because it can cause a reduction in the viability of that seed if we were carrying it over from one year for seed in the next year. So several things to consider for those in the state of Kansas this year that have found themselves in this situation.
Anything that needs taken into consideration when we think about that combine in the field?
Absolutely. So when we're thinking about trying to pick that back up, it's important that we are using some sort of a lifting attachment if it's available for your conventional platform, flex draper, things that are going to lift that back up and make sure that we're getting as much of that grain through the combine as possible when we've got heads laid down. Stripper headers can actually be a very helpful tool when we're talking about harvesting lodged wheat. It's important to be mindful of the settings for the skid plates to prevent the stripping rotor from encountering soil and taking that in. Also important to make sure that the crop deflector hood is running in a higher than normal position. Again, keeping that all rolling through. Make sure that we're being as efficient as possible and picking up that downed crop and leaving as little as possible left over for future volunteer.
And a crop that's not nearly ready for harvest like wheat is, thinking about corn, what are we seeing from the recent storms for it?
Just like Logan said, kind of depends on where that storm went through. Like last week, we had that major storm that went from Salina to Topeka with those high winds. When we think about saturated soils and in high winds, we can see root lodging, right? So that's when those corn plants start to either lean slightly or lean almost horizontally to the ground. If the corn is young enough, so think of less than 5 full leaves, it should be able to kind of stand itself back up, but kind of depending on some of those areas, if it was much taller, it can actually become a situation of green snap. So green snap is what it sounds like. That is where the plant has snapped itself in half, like not quite in half, maybe top third, bottom third, but there's a clear point where the plant was snapped. Do we see yield reductions in those situations? Yes, because the plant has been snapped. It's not going to be able to recover from that. When we think about that root lodging, it should be able to grow back out of it. We still have plenty of season as long as we don't continue to get high wind and lots of rain events. But the corn will kind of reallocate some of its resources for brace roots and kind of pull itself slightly back up towards, the way it's supposed to be standing. In some of those areas, we saw green snap, we saw a lot of that root lodging or the leaning corn. And then there was the very unlucky areas where they did get hail, right? And in those situations, we did see entire plants stripped. So hailstones hit those leaves, stripped them off, defoliated the plant. Is that going to cause damage? Yield loss? Yes. Those plants have lost their photosynthetic area or their solar panels. Hopefully, if the plant was young enough, depending on where that growing point is, they can recover, get some more leaves out, but older corn, less likely to recover. Thinking quickly about soybeans, I have not heard too much hail damage towards soybeans. Not saying it's potentially, it could be out there. We've actually been seeing more issues with oversaturated soybeans and herbicide issues where kind of this just mixed perfect storm of soybeans going in, trying to emerge. It's been warm enough, but then high, heavy amounts of rain with those herbicides, maybe a pre-emergent, causing some splash damage or even some emergence issues where those soybeans are, if they come up, look very sickly. So just kind of being aware of those situations of, is there enough soybeans there to compensate? Because soybeans can compensate for themselves when we have losses, or what can we do in that situation?
What are some options for maybe if producers think they aren't going to be able to compensate?
So with soybeans, go out there and do a plant population. If we're having less than 50 to 60,000 soybeans, we need to kind of reconsider, but also we have to think about, is it patchy, right? If you have good amount of soybeans in certain areas, it's not going to make sense to try to pull a planter across all those beans to get to that one patch, right? So I'm not trying to say we need to replant. Some of our situations, we could have enough soybeans. More than likely, we may have enough soybeans, right? Just being aware of when we do have this patchiness, if we don't fill in those patches, we just could see more weed issues. So just kind of being mindful. We have heard a lot from especially Sarah and a bunch of the ag agents. Our pre-programs for weed control have not been holding up as long as they should, probably because we have lots of growing degree units and we've been getting a lot of rain. So kind of in those situations of weeds growing out of our systems.
Tracking back to talking about corn and green snap, what are the recommendations for if you have seen a lot of that corn having green snap in a field?
Yeah, so if we see significant levels of green snap, the yield reduction that we should expect is going to hinge upon the growth and development of the crop at that moment. When we think about corn, based on some work from North Dakota State University, looking at corn that is in that B12 to B15 range, if we see 25% green snap out there in the field, we should expect about 10 to 11% yield reduction, with some of those plants compensating for the loss of some of their neighbors. This increases to 14% as we get up to V18, or just more advanced development, but still pre-tassel. Some things to consider if we do have high levels of green snap out there in the field. We're not going to be super quick to abandon a field, but some things that we need to keep in mind after these cases is that when we see reductions in our canopy cover, what this can cause is more light passing through that canopy and exposing the ground to more light that can bring on more weeds. And so controlling weeds in these damaged stands is really, really essential. It's important to consider what has been applied and what kind of additional residual products and follow-up applications may be needed to keep that ground covered. If stand losses, however, are very, very severe, we do have the opportunity to follow that crop up with something else. Following up corn, we're getting to the point across the state of Kansas that we are too late for replanting corn at this point, but we could look at some alternatives, including planting sunflowers. You could follow, depending on your herbicides and what kind of residuals may be out there. You could follow that with soybeans, grain sorghum, or some other forage crop like a forage sorghum. All of these are good options, but especially essential to be checking on your residual herbicides and what your options may still be, given what's already been applied.
Tina, Logan, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us, Shelby.
Those were two Kansas State University Extension agronomists, Tina Sullivan and Logan Simon. If you'd like to read more on this topic, you can do so by checking out a couple of recent Agronomy E-Update articles. The first one is titled Considerations for Storm Damaged Wheat. The second one is titled Assessing Storm Damage in Corn, Defoliation, Root Lodging, and Green Snap. I will link both of those in today's show notes on agtoday.net. If you would like to find them for yourself, you are able to do that by going to eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Once again, that's eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. The new world screwworm continues to be a concern. As a precaution, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says the continual and regular monitoring and evaluation of all livestock are important for herd and flock biosecurity and health considerations.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the issues that we're currently having with screwworm here in the United States. Number one, what I want to assure everyone is that our food supply is safe. So we have inspection programs in place both on the meat side as well as on the milk side that keep our food supply safe. So there's no danger to the safety of the food that you're buying in the grocery store or other places. Since early June, we've had now, as of this recording, 4 total cases identified and confirmed in the U.S. 2 of those involved calves, 1 dog, and also 1 goat. All of these are confined at this point to southern Texas. And really, we've been expecting that we would need to deal with this for some time as the screwworms have slowly moved from southern Mexico closer to the United States. And in fact, some of the models predicted that we would actually see an infestation here in the United States as early as last summer. The various control methods that we utilize have been fairly effective in slowing the spread, and we know how to deal with this. We've dealt with it before, and we will eradicate it from our production systems here in the United States, but it will take some time. want to impress on everybody that this is an infestation of an insect. It's not an infection situation. These larvae are flesh-eating, so the maggots, you'll find those in wounds or body cavity openings of animals. This could be cattle, it could be sheep, it could be pets, it could even be humans as well. So what do you need to watch for if you're a producer? Well, number one, wounds that are enlarging. Normally they would be healing, but they just continue to drain and seem to be enlarging. You also maybe see maggots in that wound or body cavity. Animal will display pain or discomfort and will have poor performance. If you notice any of these signs, please contact your local veterinarian and get the animal checked out. So the vet will have at his or her disposal many different treatment options, and they're very effective. It's not very difficult to treat the wound, but it needs to be treated and it needs to also be reported. So as we look at our major control methods that we need to practice as producers, number one is just general fly control, as you always do. Animal observations, so observing animals that might have wounds or calves that have maybe just been born. The umbilical cord area can be an issue as well. And on a higher level, our method of control of the female flies and spread of those is actually through the release of sterile male flies. The other thing that causes major spread issues for us is transport of animal or people from an infected area to a non-infected area. If we do find the screwworm larvae, there's going to be a quarantine zone set up to control the movement of animals and people, mostly animals, out of that area. Is this something we're going to be dealing with for a little while? Yes, I think so. It will take a little bit of time to get to a point where we do not find any new animals infested with the maggots. Frost will be our friend. That basically stops the reproduction of these flies. So once we get to colder temperatures this fall, our threat here in Kansas should be greatly diminished, and we may not face another issue next year, but it just kind of depends on the control of the flies in the southern areas of the United States where it's slightly warmer, as well as into neighboring Mexico. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy producers to remain vigilant. And if you find signs of these larvae in your dairy herd or other animals that you might have on the farm, please report that to your veterinarian very quickly so that treatment can start.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.